There is a printout sitting on a desk inside the Ferrari garage right now that nobody outside these four walls has read. It does not show what the world just watched on the timing screen. It does not show two red cars locking out the top of Friday practice at the Hungaroring. It shows something else entirely. A number buried 3 tabs deep in the telemetry, the one column every engineer checks before they let themselves believe a single lap time. And that number is not telling the same story the world just celebrated. Somewhere between the garage and the cameras, the truth about Ferrari's weekend split into 2 completely different versions. Only one of them is real, and it is not the one that made headlines. That split begins, as it always does, with the version everyone actually saw. On the timing screen, the story looked simple. Charles Leclerc was fastest in FP1 with a 1 minute and 19.075 seconds, Max Verstappen trailing by 0.484 seconds, and Lewis Hamilton completing a red takeover in third. It was the kind of session that writes its own headline before the cars even returned to the garage. But the session itself was far from clean. Red flags punctuated the running, starting with Leclerc's car stopping out on the pit lane, a moment that briefly threatened to unravel Ferrari's own morning before it had properly begun. Then came Lance Stroll, whose reworked Aston Martin AMR 26 suffered what looked like a rear suspension failure, sending him into a spin that chewed further into the already limited green flag running. Every minute lost to a red flag is a minute no team gets back, and by the time the session ended, several teams were left working with incomplete pictures of their own cars. None more so than Mercedes. Kimi Antonelli, the championship leader, missed FP1 entirely, handing his session over to reserve driver Frederik Vesti. That meant the man currently leading the Drivers' Championship started his own race, weekend an hour and a half behind the rest of the field, watching data come in through someone else's hands before he'd turned a single lap of his own. Then came FP2, and the story sharpened into something the paddock couldn't ignore. Hamilton went fastest with a 1 minute and 18.729 seconds, Leclerc just 0.148 seconds behind him. A genuine Ferrari front row, with nobody else within half a second of either car. For a team that has spent long stretches of this season chasing rather than leading, this was the version of Friday that made every headline. 2 red cars, comfortably clear, on a Friday that felt like a statement. It is worth sitting inside that feeling for a moment, because it is the emotional peak the rest of this story quietly dismantles. If you stopped watching after FP2, you'd walk away believing Ferrari had simply solved something. The timing screen doesn't lie about lap times, but it also doesn't explain them. The first hint that something didn't add up came not from a stopwatch, but from the radio. George Russell could be heard telling his engineer the car felt dreadful, struggling with balance under braking through the tighter sections of the Hungaroring. Across the same garage, Antonelli radioed in with a simpler, more unsettled question, asking what was going on after nearly spinning twice through the same corner. These aren't the noises of a team quietly building confidence in the background. They're the noises of a team that sounds, on the surface, like it's losing its grip on the weekend. Russell went further once the microphones were in front of him, admitting on camera that Ferrari looked a good step ahead, and that the single-lap pace simply wasn't there for Mercedes. It's a rare thing in this sport, a championship leader's teammate essentially conceding defeat out loud, on the record, before a single qualifying session has even taken place. And it's exactly the kind of quote that gets replayed, clipped, and treated as confirmation of what the timesheet already seemed to prove. But here's the question that should have been asked before anyone accepted that quote at face value. If Mercedes was actually struggling the way that radio chatter suggested, why did their long-run engineers not sound worried in the garage? Race engineers don't stay calm to be polite. They stay calm when the data in front of them tells a different story than the one being broadcast to the world. And on this particular Friday, it did. To understand why, you have to understand the difference between what wins headlines and what actually wins races. A qualifying lap is a burst, low fuel, fresh tires, every system pushed to its absolute limit for a single flying lap that lasts under 90 seconds. A long run is the opposite. It's fuel-corrected, tire-degraded data, gathered across dozens of consecutive laps that mimic actual race-stint conditions. One tells you who can look fastest for a moment. The other tells you who can actually be fastest for an entire Sunday afternoon. Every experienced engineer in this sport will tell you which of those 2 numbers they trust more, and it isn't the one that ends up on a graphic. And once that fuel and tire correction was applied to Friday's long runs, the picture flipped entirely. Antonelli's long runs were the fastest of the entire field, roughly 0.46 seconds clear of Leclerc's Ferrari per lap. That is not a rounding error. Over a full Hungaroring race distance, a gap of that size doesn't stay small. It compounds, lap after lap, into several real seconds by the time the checkered flag falls. Hamilton, for his part, was even further off that long-run number than Leclerc, meaning the driver who topped the FP2 timesheet was, by the metric that actually predicts Sunday, the furthest from the pace of all. It wasn't just Ferrari hiding behind Friday's headline numbers, either. Both Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar were also behind Antonelli's long-run figure, meaning Red Bull's own weekend was quietly worse than the timesheet let on. Which brings the whole picture into focus. Ferrari topped every screen the cameras showed, and still finished the day with more unanswered questions than Mercedes. So why did none of this show up where anyone could see it? Part of the answer is the circuit itself. The Hungaroring is tight, twisty, and threaded with more than a dozen corners, closer in character to a go-kart track than to a power circuit built to expose straight-line weaknesses. There's no long straight here to punish an underpowered engine, no obvious place for a horsepower deficit to announce itself on the timing screen the way it would at a circuit like Monza. That characteristic hasn't gone unnoticed by the people who watch this sport for a living. Ted Kravitz has floated the theory that this exact layout can mask a straight-line deficit that would otherwise be plainly visible elsewhere. Karun Chandok has pointed to Ferrari's form back in Barcelona as supporting evidence for the same idea. And Bernie Collins has drawn a direct line between Hungary and Zandvoort as the two circuits on the calendar that simply don't punish raw power the way most others do. Three separate voices, three separate angles, all converging on the same underlying suspicion that Friday's headline pace might have flattered a car that has a real problem it just hasn't been forced to show yet. The technical root of that problem reportedly traces back to a decision made well before this season even began. Ferrari built a smaller turbocharger for the new 2026 engine regulations, designed specifically to deliver an advantage at the start of races. It was a clever piece of engineering, built around a very specific moment, until the FIA mandated a 5-second start procedure that neutralized much of that intended launch day edge almost as soon as the season got underway. What's left in its place is a different kind of weakness, one that shows up not in a single explosive moment, but under sustained load. The hybrid system's electrical boost, according to the reporting around this issue, tends to run out under prolonged demand rather than during one short qualifying burst. That is precisely the kind of weakness a long, heavy fuel stint at a circuit like the Hungaroring is built to expose, and precisely the kind of weakness a single flying lap on fresh rubber is built to hide. Ferrari does have a fix in the works, but not one that arrives anytime soon. The reported rework involves the same impeller diameter on the turbocharger, but with a different blade count, altered blade angle, and new materials. Changes aimed squarely at the underlying issue rather than papering over it. The problem is timing. That rework isn't expected to arrive before Zandvoort or Monza, both of which sit on the far side of the summer break. There's a real irony buried in that timeline. Zandvoort is itself a low-speed, high-downforce circuit, much like Hungary, which means Ferrari could end up masking the exact same weakness a second time before the car is ever actually fixed. Monza, by contrast, is the true reveal point on the horizon. It's a genuine power circuit, one where a straight-line deficit has nowhere left to hide behind clever aerodynamics or a forgiving layout, which means the real, unfiltered answer about this engine doesn't arrive until deep into the second half of the season. In the meantime, Ferrari has been trying to answer an engine problem with aerodynamics, a stopgap rather than a cure. At Spa, that meant an updated rotating rear wing and the removal of a device at the exhaust head specifically to cut drag. For Hungary, it meant a small additional winglet, built specifically to compensate for a circuit with no straights long enough to punish the car's real weakness. The insight underneath all of it is simple but important. An aero tweak can hide a weakness on the right layout, but it cannot cure one everywhere. Every strong Ferrari weekend before the summer break now carries an asterisk, whether the headlines choose to print it or not. Which brings the story back to the two people who actually understood all of this in real time and chose not to celebrate. In the press pin after FP2, Charles Leclerc sounded cautious rather than triumphant, saying plainly that he didn't expect the gap to hold into Saturday, and that the team will have to do everything perfectly if it wanted to convert Friday's pace into anything real. Fred Vasseur, meanwhile, chose his words even more carefully, so far so good, before reminding everyone listening that nobody takes pole, let alone wins a race, on a Friday. That restraint matters more than it might first appear. These are the two people with access to the exact long-run numbers the public only found out about later. Their caution wasn't modesty, it was foresight. While the rest of the world was busy reacting to a timesheet, the two men who actually understood what that timesheet didn't say were already bracing for Saturday. Even outside the two title-adjacent camps, there was a third red on the weekend, arguably the most objective one in the entire paddock. Oscar Piastri offered a notably neutral assessment, saying Ferrari looked very quick across both sessions while calling Mercedes very hard to read, adding that everyone would find out more once Saturday arrived. It's worth remembering why McLaren's perspective carries particular weight here. Close enough in both championship battles that neither a Ferrari surge nor a Mercedes recovery is genuinely good news for them. Piastri had no incentive to inflate or deflate either story, and even he wasn't willing to call it, which reinforces the central tension running underneath this entire weekend. Nobody who actually understands the data is willing to call this yet, no matter how loud Friday's headlines were. Zoom out far enough, and the championship table adds its own layer of context to everything that happened on this particular Friday. Antonelli leads Hamilton by 45 points in the standings, with Russell a further 5 points back in third. In the Constructors' Championship, Mercedes sits 73 points clear of Ferrari. Put in perspective, 45 points is nearly 2 full race wins, a gap that a single strong Friday, however dramatic, cannot close on its own. That context matters for Hamilton in particular. He has been public about his belief that he can still fight for the championship in a weekend like this. One strong session, undercut almost immediately by long-run data telling a very different story, is exactly the kind of evidence that belief needs to survive contact with the scoreboard. And the window for that fight is shrinking by the week. Every session before the summer break represents one of a diminishing number of chances for Ferrari to actually cut into that lead, rather than simply talk about doing it. Which leaves this weekend balanced on a single, unresolved question: which sheet actually wins? The one that put two red cars on top of Friday, or the one that put a Mercedes on top of the only session that resembles what Sunday will actually demand? Qualifying rewards the first number. The race runs on the second. And Ferrari's car still hasn't received the fix it needs to close that gap. A timesheet only tells you who was fastest for one lap on one afternoon, with everything set up to make that lap look as good as possible. It never tells you who wins on Sunday. Both numbers from this Hungaroring Friday came from the exact same track, generated on the exact same afternoon, and they are still pointing in opposite directions. Formula One's real stories rarely live on the surface. They live in the numbers nobody puts on a graphic, in the caution of a team principal who knows more than he's saying, in the gap between what a stopwatch shows and what a race actually demands. This weekend isn't over, and whichever version of Friday turns out to be real won't stay hidden past Sunday afternoon.